Then, of course, there was the Cedar Bar, where I became friends with painters my own age, Mimi and Paul Brock, Joan Mitchell, Mike Goldberg, Howard Kanovitz. I think it was at the Cedar that I first met the poet Frank O'Hara, but O'Hara deserves a volume to himself. One evening, while I was still a newly arrived immigrant at the Cedar Bar, Elaine and Willem de Kooning casually took my arm as they passed and said, "Come on over to Clem Greenberg's." There were just a few people when we got there. After a while, I found myself listening to Greenberg, who was talking about Cézanne. De Kooning showed signs of impatience and seemed to be trying to control his anger. He finally broke out with, "One more word about Cézanne and I'll punch you in the nose." Greenberg, very startled, had been saying only the very intelligent and perceptive things. It was hard for him to understand that what de Kooning resented was his having ideas on the matter at all. "You have no right to talk about Cézanne," de Kooning snapped. "Only I have the right to talk about Cézanne." Walking into Greenberg's, I remember the feeling of not knowing just who anybody was. But as I left that night, I knew who de Kooning was. I didn't feel he was arrogant. I didn't feel he was rude. For me, coming from a background where the emotional life was a buried discourse, this kind of vulnerability was like my introduction not only to the art world, but to reality itself. It took me out of my romantic dream of what it was to be an artist, into the reality of it. It also showed me, through Greenberg, that the real Philistines are those that most understand you. Until the 50s, the overall trend of American painting was chiefly preoccupied with capturing a certain ethnic, regional flavor, the art itself being a conceptual shortcut to this. Even an artist like Dove seems to come to art somewhat like a gentleman farmer. He has genius, but it is still a sort of landed gentry genius. The Whitney Museum in Greenwich Village was the stronghold of this WASP bohemia. The beautiful building, taken over now by the New York Studio School, still stands on 8th Street. I lectured there recently, and while wandering through the upper floors, looked in on what used to be Mrs. Whitney's studio. This room was like a page out of a Henry James novel. In contrast to all this charming Americana, one remembers the power, the impact of those first abstract expressionist shows at the Betty Parsons, Egan, and Coots galleries. In this context, an artist like Bradley Tomlin, who had gone over to the abstract expressionists, stood out almost like a traitor to his class. I continually think of Tomlin. I think of him at that table in the Cedar, aristocratic, aloof, most often alone. Still, he came. Occasionally, too, Motherwell, bringing in what Willa Cather somewhere called the world shine, a young Hamilton adjusting his lace cuff at Valley Forge. As I have written elsewhere, there were two diametrically opposed points of view I had to cope with in those days, one represented by John Cage, the other by Philip Guston. Cage's idea, summed up years later in the words, "Everything is music," had led him more and more toward a social point of view, less and less toward an artistic one. Like Mayakovsky, who gave up his art for society, Cage gave up art to bring it together with society. Then there was Guston. He was the arch crank. Very little pleased him. Very little satisfied him. Very little was art. Always aware in his own work of the rhetorical nature of the complication, Guston reduces, building his own Tower of Babel and then destroying it. Personally, I have never understood the term action painting as a description of the work of the 50s. The closest I can come to its meaning is that the painter tries for a less predeterminate structure. This does not mean, however, that there was an indeterminate intention. If indeed there is an emphasis on action, it is the attempt to capture a certain spontaneity always inherent in drawing and now applied to larger forces. Guston's drawings, for instance, have the look of paintings, while his paintings have the feel of drawings. To varying degrees, One can say the same of much of the work done in the 50s. My quarrel with the term action painting is that it gave rise to the erroneous idea that the painter, now being free, could do anything he liked. But it is not at all true that the more one is free, the more things one has to choose from. Actually, it is the academician who has the alternatives. Freedom is best understood by someone like Rothko, who was free to do only one thing, to make a Rothko, and did so over and over again. It is not freedom of choice that is the meaning of the 50s, but the freedom of people to be themselves. This type of freedom creates a problem for us because we are not free to imitate it. In every other era, the messianic aspect of art has always been sought for in some organizing principle, since this principle is, and always has been, what saves us in art. What is hard to understand about the 50s is that these men did not want to be saved in art. That is why, in terms of influence, and who thinks in any other terms, they have not made what is sometimes called an artistic contribution. What they did was to make the whole notion of artistic contribution a lesser thing in art. Ryder once said about one of his paintings that it had everything but what he wanted. What Ryder wanted was the 50s. Ryder was aware that it is not the unifying principle and not the artistic achievement that make the experience behind a work of art. To me, it has never seemed an accident that he walked the same pavement on University Place. In temperament, in the emotional tradition of his work, he was the first abstract expressionist. Nietzsche teaches us that only the first 5 steps of an action can be planned. Beyond that, on any long-range basis, one must invent a dialectic in order to survive. Until the 50s, the artist believed that he must not improvise as the bull charged, that he must adhere to the formal ritual, the unwasted motion, the accumulated knowledge that reinforces the courage of the matador, and that allows the spectator the ecstasy of feeling that he too, by knowing all that must be known to survive in the bull ring, has himself defied the gods, has himself defied death. To survive without this dialectic is what the 50s left us. Before that, American painting had concerned itself with efficient solutions. The abstract expressionists were making bigger demands on their gifts and their energies. Their movement took the world by storm. Nobody now denies it. On the other hand, what are we to do with it? There is no tradition. All we are left with is a question of character. What training have we ever had to understand what is ultimately nothing more than a question of character? What we are trained for is analysis. The entire dialectic of art criticism has come about through the analysis of bad painting. Take Franz Klein. There is no plastic experience. We don't stand back and behold the painting. There is no painting in the ordinary sense, just as there is no painting, for that matter, in Piero della Francesca or Rembrandt. There is nothing but the integrity of the creative act. Any detail of the work is sufficient to establish this. The fact that these details accumulate and make what is known as a work of art proves nothing. What else should an artist do with his time? Now, almost 20 years later, I see what happens to work. I ask myself more and more why everybody knows so much about art. Thousands of people, teachers, students, collectors, critics, everybody knows everything. To me, it seems as though the artist is fighting a heavy sea in a rowboat, while alongside him a pleasure liner takes all these people to the same place. Every graduate student today knows exactly what degree of angst belongs in a de Kooning, can point out disapprovingly just where he is let up, relaxed. Everybody knows that one Bette Davis movie where she went out of style. It's another bull ring, with everybody knowing the rules of the game. What was great about the 50s is that for one brief moment, maybe, say, 6 weeks, nobody understood art. That's why it all happened, because for a short while, these people were left alone. 6 weeks is all it takes to get started. But there's no place now where you can hide out for 6 weeks in this town. Well, that's what it was like to be an artist in New York, Paris, or anywhere else.